Hello, and welcome to the first ever episode of Behind the Story. I'm Eli Sherman. Each week, we'll be taking you behind the scenes with journalists who are telling some of the most interesting and intriguing stories from across Rhode Island and southeastern Massachusetts. This week, I have the pleasure of introducing my co-host, 12 News anchor, Kim Kalunian, and Boston Globe columnist Dan McGowan. Welcome, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Great to be here. I'm excited.
So I want to start off by just introducing ourselves a little bit to the viewers and why we're doing this show. And a little bit later, we'll get into the journalism itself. But the three of us all sort of have similar origin stories. And I want to start with you, Kim. Mm-hmm. You've become such a well-known name and face in our market. But you, like many young reporters, started in the trenches of hyperlocal news.
And that is for sure. I actually started as an intern doing a senior project while I was still in high school at the Warwick Beacon, which was my hometown newspaper. I wanted to do something outside of my comfort zone, and it was very much outside of my comfort zone. I like to say I went to the John Howell School of Journalism, and he taught me everything I needed to know about writing, AP style, how to do an interview, what inches meant. I had never written for a newspaper before. And then I ended up freelancing there and then getting hired full time as a staff reporter, spent about 2 years at the Beacon, and then went to WPRI Radio, where I actually started behind the scenes on their website writing listicles, which was a lot of fun and kind of random.
I should say fantastic listicle.
Well, thank you, Dan. I appreciate that. Like the 12 fast food chains you wish would come to Rhode Island. This was like before Sonic and Chick-fil-A. Some really hard-hitting journalism. But then I moved to an on-air position as a reporter and then as the drive time anchor alongside Buddy Cianci. Mm-hmm. And I was
Who
there.
Dan knows very well.
Very well. We all sort of did.
True.
Right?
Yeah, strangely.
It wouldn't be a Rhode Island story if we didn't all know Buddy pretty well. And went from WPRO after a couple of years, took some time off, and then came here to WPRI in the end of 2015. So at the end of this year, I'll have been here 10 years.
Wow.
Which kind of blows my mind.
Okay, Kim. Well, I just got to jump in because I want to show you something real quick.
Okay, this solves a mystery that arose
we
this
have
morning.
here on the screen. This is young Kim Kalunian
Great
from
sweater, Kim.
way back.
Wow.
And I think we might even be talking about this story a little bit later. But this was one of your very first TV appearances here at WPRI.
We were talking about Buddy and his passing.
Yeah.
And I'm really glad that you're not playing the audio because my voice, I sounded sort of like a mouse. And I think I've settled into a deeper tone.
I think of you as a lion now.
Oh, thank you, Dan. Thank you. Wow. Someone flagged to me earlier that they found a video called Young Kim Kalunian in our internal database. And I said, does that mean I'm old now? I guess it does, but that's okay. We were wondering who created it. You have solved the mystery, Eli. Thank you.
Well, I want to ask you, Kim, because you've gone from newspapers to radio, now in TV. Mm-hmm. Do you think, well, first off, knowing full well that maybe your bosses are going to be watching this later, but
Sure.
Is TV the medium that you prefer now?
Yes, 100%. And listen, I love radio and I love print, but the great thing about Channel 12, frankly, is that we get to do all three somehow. I mean, we're not printing physical newspapers, but we're writing web stories for WPRI.com. This is going to be a podcast, so it scratches that radio itch, and I love being on television. You're connecting with people in a very unique way when they invite you into their living room every night. I don't take that for granted, and I absolutely love it.
Okay, before we switch gears to Dan, I just want to ask one more question. Do you remember your very, very first story way back at the Beacon?
At the Beacon, I want to say it was something. It was not a heavy lift. It was like a ribbon cutting or something like that. I want to say maybe at like a new Citizens Bank branch, and it was supposed to be a simple assignment for a 17-year-old who had never written for a newspaper before. I think I cried because I had such a hard time with it. So lots of respect to those budding cub reporters out there.
Okay, Dan, you now, of course, are at the Boston Globe as a columnist, but like the three of us, and we should note to viewers that the three of us have been crossing paths professionally for well over a decade, not to date ourselves, but you also come from some humble beginnings. So I want you to talk a little bit about how you came to Rhode Island, because this isn't where you're from originally, and your path all the way to the Boston Globe.
Yeah, sure. We should note that you said we've crossed paths. I think we've grown up together in journalism, the three of us.
Fair.
There's a handful of other people in the market, and I think it's really fun to be working with you guys, and it's fun to see sort of how we've all maintained our jobs in this business. I have that weird situation in local news where I feel like I've worked for so many different places, and I haven't been fired by anybody yet.
Congratulations.
I say yes. Right? But I grew up actually in Connecticut, just sort of down the road, an hour and a half away outside of New Haven, and journalism is the only thing I've ever wanted to do. I don't know that I do it well, but it's the only thing I've even done remotely close to well. I always say, like, when I was a little kid, I was pretty self-reflective, and so I knew by like 7 years old that I probably wasn't going to be a pitcher in baseball. I wasn't big enough to be a professional wrestler, and so I thought, you know what, I'm going to find a way to write about those things.
Smart.
And I have to some degree, although I somehow ventured into politics, but I started as a journalist in Rhode Island in 2010 covering the Providence mayoral race. And I still at the time was thinking my goal was to go off to Sports Illustrated. At the time, Sports Illustrated still mattered. And I thought, I want to go write magazine profiles about athletes and cover controversial things. And I was blogging for free for Rhode Island's Future, covering the mayoral race.
Wow.
I got in very early at Go Local Prov, so I was like digital first. And then I made the advance to Channel 12. I worked for.
And I want to stop you right there because, like him, we do have some footage that we'd like to show from your time.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
WPRI.
This is so
young
embarrassing,
Dan.
Eli. Why didn't you warn us ahead of time?
This is young Dan wearing a tie, we should note, which is great.
I think that's Ted Nisi's time.
That makes sense.
Looks familiar.
So you can go on. You, of course, came to WPRI.
Well, I tried my best as possible to stay off of television. In fact, I think my first real TV hit actually at Channel 12 was, we talked about Buddy.
Yeah.
It was on 2014 election night. And I was at Buddy Cianci's victory party or watch party, because it wasn't a victory party. And I remember they were watching actually a different station. And the returns were coming in, and they were looking good for him. But meanwhile, I was on the side texting with him, knowing the race was over. And so Steve Nielsen, who are another one of our very good friends who worked in this market forever, and I were on TV to live to talk about this. Everybody in back of us is cheering, they're high-fiving, everybody's drinking. And they cut to me, and I say, it's not going to be Buddy's night. And immediately when I got off the air on that 2-minute hit, I get a call from Karen Resendiz, who's the news director at Channel 12, who says, it is not your job to call races.
Oh, wow.
But we had known
at least you're
what
right.
was happening, and it turns out we were running with Jorge Lourdes and won that race. And so I worked at Channel 12 for 6 years. I got to work with Kim. Eli and I actually didn't overlap at Channel 12, but we were good friends.
You were a reference for me actually when I applied here.
Well, it was a bad reference, so I don't know.
Hey, I got the job.
Against all odds.
And so in 2019, the Globe decided to expand into Rhode Island, and Brian McGrory, the editor of the Globe at the time, called me and said, hey, what do you think about this? We've heard your name. And we took it from there, and now it's been 6 years that I've been at the. So I've actually been at the Globe longer than I was at Channel 12, which is shocking to me.
So I'll ask the same question to you. You did digital, then you went to TV, and now you're in print, which is also crossover with digital, of course. Do you feel like print is where you belong?
Well, somehow I keep getting dragged onto TV, and so no, I do. Yeah, I love. First of all, I love the Globe. I love the reach that you have. I love the ability, in my case now as a columnist, to be able to kind of really pick and choose everything that I'm writing about, and get to say, like, look, this is what I feel is important. I don't have to really answer to anybody. So all of that is a luxury. But I think in this business nowadays, we have to be on all screens and everywhere, and so everything else, podcasts, TV, radio, is all part of doing business.
Okay, well, we have to take a quick break, but when we come back, unsolved murders and newsletters. Stick with us. Hi, and welcome back to Behind the Story. I'm Eli Sherman, joined by 12 News anchor Kim Kalunian and Boston Globe columnist Dan McGowan. I want to dive right into the journalism now, and I want to highlight a couple things that I think that these two do extremely well. And I want to start with you, Kim. For the past 5 years now, Kim, you have been doing special reports on cold cases, and that's homicides that have gone unsolved for years, sometimes even decades. And I want to talk about it, but we actually have a little video that we want to show you first.
Is typically the main thing that families of these cold case victims want.
He was my baby.
It's closure that's often long overdue.
That's one night, that stays in my mind forever.
There's the goal to keep their memories alive.
You know, I know we buried so much about her over the years because of the hurt and the pain.
There's sometimes lingering anger and frustration.
And no one volunteered to help my son.
Sometimes thoughts of what if.
Sorry I didn't come home that night, and I wish I was around.
For the families of the missing, it's the wondering and the waiting.
Terrible. Hoping he was going to be walking through the door.
And for others, there are new mysteries to be unearthed.
Now it's just a matter of identifying the skeleton within.
Among them all, there remains hope for justice.
And he said, "Kristen, we got him." And I said, "About time."
I like that quite a bit.
Oh,
That's a good compilation of your work. Kim, I watch these specials every time you come out with them, and they are just so hard hitting and emotional, and you heard it in the people's voices who were just talking there. And do you find it to be a tough subject to cover?
Yes, there was definitely a time a couple of years ago, I want to say, where I sort of took a step back and did like a historical cold case that was just a little bit easier emotionally to digest, frankly, because it is so hard talking to these families and hearing these stories. I was just looking at a spreadsheet that I keep of all of the cold cases that we've done. And you mentioned Steve Nielsen, Dan, our former colleague. He started this series before I did. And between the two of us, we've covered more than 80 different cases.
Wow.
And you just think about the grief that comes along with every single one of those cases, and the not knowing, the not having closure, the not having answers. It's really hard. But I approach this as a way to give these families an outlet to remember their loved ones, to try and dredge up new tips and potentially solve these. And it's fabulous because some of them have either been solved or are in the process of being solved, as you heard at the end there. That's the Carl Seebeck case. That was his daughter, Kristen, who was at the arraignment of a suspect in that case now. That just happened a couple months ago. So there is hope, which is the great thing.
Have you, have you heard from law enforcement that this is also helpful in terms of dredging up those new tips, as you mentioned?
Yeah, I think a lot of law enforcement is very eager to have these stories put back out in the spotlight again, because whenever they can get new information on a case that's been sitting for a while, it's going to be super helpful. Another thing that's been happening is the advancements in DNA technology has been an absolute game changer in so many of these cases. As we know, DNA testing takes time, so there's still, a waiting period for answers, but I think that gives people a lot of renewed hope too.
How often do you pick a case and you find that the family or law enforcement is just like, no, sorry, Kim, we're not touching this one? And you do you still tell those stories, or do you try to get the families on board before you're going to share their story?
Yeah, my process currently is to try and get the families on board, because oftentimes you're unearthing something, a trauma that's maybe been packed away and that the family doesn't want to face again, and I try to respect that. So if a family's not willing to talk, I try to respect those wishes and not do the story. If law enforcement isn't willing to talk, I still do the story if the family wants their loved one's case out there again. It's rare that law enforcement doesn't want to talk about these cases because, again, I think most of the time the detectives on these cases are eager for new tips to come out.
It kind of eats at the detectives. I mean, we forget that sometimes.
Of course.
These guys and women, they're up at night thinking about these, especially the cold cases.
It's a very good point, Dan. There's one detective that I talked to up in Rentham who's dad worked the case and then he took it over. And so, I mean, sometimes these span generations. And yes, it's these detectives want answers just like the families do.
Okay, Dan, you, as you mentioned earlier, helped launch the Boston Globe Rhode Island Bureau back in 2019, and you created a newsletter called Roadmap. And for many, including myself, it has become a part of the daily news consumption routine. So I want you to talk a little bit about, well, actually first, I know you, and I know that you wake up extraordinarily early sometimes to put this together. So do you miss your mornings?
Not at all. Here's the thing. When I worked at Channel 12, I used to wake up at 3 in the morning every single night because that's when the Journal used to publish all of their news stories. And so on just not on alarm or anything, I would just wake up at 3 a.m. to see if the Journal had beaten me on anything. And then I would...
That's true competition.
Wow.
And I would stay up all night and freak out if they did. And so I'm kind of used to it. I now have a 2-year-old at home too. And so you don't sleep that much anyway. So it's totally fine.
That fits into it. I want you to talk a little bit about the success of it, because I do honestly think that for something so new as, you know, we're talking only now 6 years, 5 years of its existence, I think that it's had serious market penetration in Rhode Island and even beyond. I mean, you can probably see where people are opening your emails from, but what has that growth been like?
Yeah, I mean, it's been huge, and it worked almost right away. I'd like to believe that it's entirely me, but it's not. It's, you know, what we talked about in opening the Rhode Island Bureau at the Globe was, let's start to try to think about ways to either distribute our news or report on things that others aren't doing, right? We have a paywall. We're behind, you know, it's an expensive subscription. So what are the ways we can get to people? And the two things that we thought right off the bat that I pitched in my job interview were a daily newsletter, which we didn't really have at the time, at least not a curated sort of one with a voice in Rhode Island. So Roadmap is that. And then doing live events, which we've spun off, Roadmap Live. We have a lot of those events.
I just went to one a couple weeks ago.
Exactly. And so, you know, and those, look, there's a business side to this, and those can generate a lot of revenue, a lot of advertising, those kind of things. And so that's really helpful. And so having those two products, just it's a way to differentiate yourself in the market. And so what we've been able to do with Roadmap, and look, we have a great team at the Globe. We now have 7-8 reporters and editors who are focused solely on Rhode Island. So we have a wonderful, wonderful team. And so I'm able to kind of really highlight and promote the work that my wonderful colleagues are doing. And then I always get to write something at the top of the newsletter that I think is new, interesting. I like to either break stories or analyze news. And, you know, we've grown pretty quickly. We hit, I think in the first year, 25 or 30,000 daily subscribers. We're now up to somewhere around 140,000 subscribers. Wow. I wish I could tell you that 140,000 people open Roadmap every day. That's not true. We're not going to talk about the other numbers. But no, look, it has worked really well. I think generally speaking, the movers and shakers, you know, are all reading Roadmap. But what's most remarkable is it's not even intended for them, right? It's for the average, it's for the person that you see in the grocery store that's maybe paying a little bit of attention to Rhode Island news. And I feel like I have found a way to break through to those people as well as kind of the insiders.
Yeah, I think one thing that I really like about it, and this may just be the way that it came to be, is that, you know, I follow all of your great colleagues on social media, so usually see their stories when they come out anyways. But if there's something that I miss, that really is a way, and you mentioned it, just an avenue for me to see the Rhode Island relevant news each day that you and your team are doing over at the Boston Globe in a very neat place, so that if I did miss something, I can click in there and see it as well. So
yeah, I mean, the number one thing that we had to do bringing the Globe to Rhode Island was say, hey, we promise we're actually Rhode Islanders, right? We live in Rhode Island, we have an office here. And so having a kind of landing spot for my colleagues and for myself is really important, because not everybody's going to think to go to the Globe's website and click the Rhode Island link, or, you know, you're not going to see every Rhode Island story in print in the Globe. And so having this, you know, very convenient email, kind of, I like to pitch it as, it's sort of like listening to your friend tell you about the news. I try to be light and sort of casual with it. It's a different way of explaining what's happening, but I like to believe, generally speaking, I deliver the goods as well.
Can I just say, I don't think I've ever gotten a correct answer to the "so you think you're a Rhode Islander" question. They're so hard, and I'm from here.
There's a question each day in his newsletter that asks some trivia about Rhode Island, and I'm with you.
They're hard.
They are often quite tough.
Think about how to come up with that.
Yeah, fair enough.
We have to take another quick break, but when we come back, what other stories around the market stood out to us this week and why? Stick with us. Hi, and welcome back to Behind the Story. I'm joined by 12 News anchor Kim Kalunian and Boston Globe columnist Dan McGowan. Guys, we're going to do some highlighting of other great journalism that's happening around the market, and there's a lot of it we should note, but these are some of the stories that really stood out to us as of late. And I want to start with you, Dan.
I'm going to start with a familiar name, my colleague Steph Machado, who used to work at Channel 12. We promise we will feature other people as well at some point, has been covering this very bonkers story about the NAACP in Providence. And, at a moment in time where organizations like the NAACP are probably more vital than ever, if you think nationally and everything that's happening in Washington, the NAACP in Providence, which has a really long history, really rich history, really important organization here, is in total shambles. And Steph Machado broke the story today that the FBI is now investigating.
We should note that we're taping a little bit early, so it wasn't today that the story was broken, but go ahead.
Sometime she broke the story, and they're investigating claims of potentially financial mismanagement at the organization. The NAACP kind of nationally has sort of stepped in and kind of taken over the local organization. And again, it's a tragic story, I think, for an important civic organization, but it's actually a great journalism story as well.
Yeah, great. Kim, what'd you see?
Well, I will just say a story I wish that I wrote is anything by Alexa Gagas, because she goes to the most fabulous restaurants. And I'm really, Alexa, if you're watching, please take me out sometime and let's get razor clams. But a story that I really want to shout out is by my colleague, Alex Torres Perez, who got this scoop from the education commissioner, Angelica Infante Green, that state leaders are now going to hold kids back a grade level if they miss too much school. This is going to their big push that attendance really matters, that kids need to not miss too many days of school or else, their learning really suffers. Now, of course, there's some other conditions that the education commissioner said will apply to these kids. But when I saw this story pop up, I was really struck by the headline. And anytime you get a scoop, I'm impressed. So shouting out Alex Torres Perez.
Great story, Alex. And the story that I really am taken to, and there's some subjectivity here because it's an issue that I've also covered in the past, is Antonia Farzan from the Providence Journal. I'm going out of house on this one, guys. Okay. She has been doing some tremendous reporting over the past 2 years on the effort to legalize kratom, which is a Southeast Asian plant that people use to solve addiction. And it's legalized in many, many states, but it hasn't been legalized here. And there was an effort last year, actually, that got through the General Assembly, both houses, the House and the Senate, and it was vetoed by Governor Dan McGowan. So now there's this renewed effort, and she just does a really good job of breaking down not only, what the pros and the cons are from the advocates and the opponents, but she has a very good way of interweaving the dynamics of money and politics behind it. And so I highly recommend that people go out there and check that out. I think that is all of the time that we're going to have today. I know it really flew by, and we can't thank you enough for tuning in for the first episode. Next week, we will have another journalist on who's been making waves in the market to talk about their work and what they're doing. And full episodes of each of these will be posted on our website at WPRI.com. They'll also be available on YouTube. And you can also download this, as we mentioned off the top, as a podcast. And I think we're going to probably bring back this last segment as a stories we wish we wrote, right? That's a pretty good name for it. But that is all the time that we have today. For Kim Kalunian and Dan McGowan, I'm Eli Sherman.